The UV tools found in Maya are really one of my favorite UV tools in any 3D software. They are incredibly powerful and will help you with really any UV job you might have. For this video, let's load up the accompanying files, uvmappingbasics.ma, and we will also use a workspace called UV editing, which you can just find right here. So if we just look over here under our models, you can see we now have a cube selected. Let's take a quick look here at the UV editor as well. And this is where we now have all the UV tools we need, and we can actually see our UVs. So we're not really going to go into what UVs actually are. We will assume that you have an understanding of that. But just really quickly, it's a 2D representation of the 3D model, which means that you can now paint maps here, which will translate to 3D. So what we have is we have all the UDMs here. This is where we can see all the UV space we have. This is where you want to keep all your UVs. You want to keep them all within this first tile here. You can see down here it says 0 and here it says 1. So you really want to keep all your UVs within here unless you're working with UDM system, which we'll cover a bit later in this video. If you go here, we can see that we now have our UVs displayed as a wireframe. So by default, this is what we're going to be seeing. Then we can also see them as shaded. This just depends on your personal preference and how complex the model is. Then we can also display them as with distortion. So now they just look white, which looks completely pointless, but that's because there is no distortion whatsoever on this model here, on these UVs. But what if we were to just drag one of these points like up here? Now you can see that this here is, we're creating a lot of distortion within our actual model. So sometimes this is useful. I usually don't work with this active, but I usually work with wireframe active. And then here we can change if we want to see the actual UV seams in the viewport or not. This is really handy when you're actually UV mapping, but it can be really annoying when you're not UV mapping. Like when your UVs are done and you're not touching this ever again. Now there's no point actually having them here, but it's still really useful. Then we have the grid. You really want to display the grid at all times. And then we have isolate selected as well. Really quite useful in certain cases, though I tend to not use this a whole lot. I'm a bit more old school, so if I want to move my UVs around and just isolate, I'm just can tend to move them around like so and move them back. But this is also a good option as well. The very first tool we are going to be looking into is really the planar project tool. This just means that we can select any face and we can make a planar projection based on that. So we can find these tools under UV. Make sure you're under the modeling tab. So under UV, let's just dock this. So we are now going to be looking into the planar map right here. So if we click it now you can see what happens. We now get a UV map for this specific area, which is really handy. We can now move this around and now you can see what happens. We can do the same thing here. Now if we hit the G key, we can do the same thing. And we can just move this around like so. Hit the G key again, and now we get a different cut for each one of these guys. So a planar map is really one of the most useful ones for, like if you're doing buildings or just for general UV mapping, where you're now able to take a section of the model and then just UV map this specific section of it. So for instance, if you have a building here and need to have bricks on top of it, you can do that. If we go to the settings for it, you can see here we have one called best plane. And this is just going to say where it actually is going to project from. So you can see now that when we hit the G key, it actually correctly gets the best plane for it. Like it doesn't do a top view from this view here. It actually does the correct plane, which is really handy. So I tend to use best plane at all times whenever I'm UV mapping like this. Before we get too far into this, we are going to set up a UV shader. This is so that we can actually see the distortion stretching on the model. So we do this very simply by right mouse button. Then we go to favorite materials. So we can set this to a Lambert. Now over here, remember we have all these nodes now. We can just hit Alt Shift D and delete history for them. All these are live still, so we can just do that. And then under color, we can now click on the input. And when we do this, we can now assign a file node to this. This just means we have now a way of actually inputting a file. Let's click here. And now we have an image name under here. We can now click. And this is now where we will go to our materials. And then we will find the UV checker. Click here. And then we have to enable textures in the viewport as well. Essentially what we're doing now, we're just applying a regular texture map to this. So click on this. This is where we can display textures in the viewport. And now we have the actual texture here, but we want to tile this a few more times. So let's go into the place to the texture. Remember, these are just nodes. So now we have a file now, which just shows you what a file is. And then we have to tile this with the place to the texture node. So we can set this on a repeat UVs, just how many times it's going to do, how many times it's going to repeat it. And I set this to 5. That's just, I usually set between 5 and 7. And I can see here that this tiles at a bunch of different times. And now what we're going to be doing is if we click on this button here, now we go back into the different nodes, just so we can go up a few steps. Now it's in Lambert, we're going to call this UV checker. This is one of these we're going to keep applying to all the different models throughout this entire series, or throughout this entire video. So now we have a nice UV checker here. So now, for instance, you can see here that if we were to select a face, go to UV, set it to planar, and now if we were to scale this up, now you can see that we're actually scaling this up and down. So now this is why we have this checker, because it's really important that we make sure that they have the same scale. Navigation in the UV viewport is exactly the same as we have in Maya, where we use Alt middle mouse button to pan around and Alt right mouse button to zoom in and out. We move with W, just a W key and move this around, E to rotate, and an R for scale as well. And you don't really have to hit the R key and click on this. You can just drag here with the middle mouse button. Do the same with, if you hit W, you can just start to move this around as well, like so. Just by holding the middle mouse button, dragging it around. So that's super useful stuff. Then we're going to take a look at another model here. It's a bit more complicated. So we want to UV map this model here. Now we are going to be using two methods here. We're going to be using cylindrical mapping, and we're going to be using planar mapping. So I tend to use these two the most when it comes to hard surface models. And I use a mapping which corresponds mostly to what this actually looks like. So instead of using one map method for everything, I'm going to use two. So I'm going to be using planar mapping for this area here, because this is planar, and I'm going to same here, and I'm going to use cylindrical mapping for all this because, well, that's cylindrical. So what I'll do is I'll select this vert here, and then I'll do Control right mouse button, two faces, and let's select this entire guy. And then we'll go to UV, and we'll do planar, and now we have a nice little map here. We can just move this up. Oh, and before I forget, right click, assign existing material this time, and UV checker. And now you can see. So there's already a map applied to this. That's just a general planar map for the entire thing, just to keep it simple. But this is what we're doing. Obviously, we can't do anything with this. So now we have a map here, and there's no stretching whatsoever, like you can see. Then we go on the bottom, do the same thing, select the single point, Control right mouse button, two faces, and then we do the same thing where we go to UV, and we go to planar, or what you can do Shift right mouse button in the UV editor, and now we get up the same tools. We have mapping, planar map, and then we just hit planar map, and there we go. Middle mouse button to drag it up here as well. And now we can select all these guys here. We can select them, of course, in the viewport as well, or we can select them in the UV editor. That's really the same thing. These two are live. So if you select a polygon here, it's going to be selected here as well. So select the rest of this shape here. And you can see there's a lot of stretching here. So obviously we need to UV map this as well. And then what we do, we go to UV and we go to cylindrical mapping. This is going to wrap a cylinder around it like so. So now you can see we have a nice cylindrical mapping, and we have a nice cut here as well. So we generally get fairly decent UVs with this as well. Now we will have to unfold this, and we'll cover this a bit later on, but this is to get a pretty nice starting point for a shape like this. So let's hide this guy. You could of course go in here and start modifying all these as well to your heart's content. But for now, we're just going to leave this be. Hit the H key to hide it. And then we'll look into an overall workflow for doing UVs. So here's a model which has obviously terrible UVs. This is just completely broken, and we have to UV map it properly. And also it's green. And why is it green? Well, this is because it doesn't have a shader assigned to it. So the moment you assign any shader to it, then it's going to disappear. The greenness is going to disappear. So what we're going to be doing now is we're going to right mouse button. Then we're going to go to add existing material, and then we're going to UV checker. So the general workflow now is that we are going to be assigning a planar map to this. This is just to get it into the UV editor, and then we can start doing our thing to it there. So what I prefer to do is I prefer to just select it here, then select all the polygons, then shift right mouse button and mapping or planar mapping. Well, you can also just do this in a quick way, just shift right mouse button, drag up like we've done in the viewport as well. So now we just have it here. And you can see though that it looks pretty good from the front view because that's where we're projecting from, but from the sides it looks pretty dodgy. So we're gonna have to be fixing all of this. But before we do that, let's cover some of the most essential tools we have for UV mapping. So the first one we're going to be looking into is the cut tool. The cut tool allows us to cut away portions of the UVs here into different islands. So if you right mouse button, then we can go to edge, and same selection tools here as we have in the viewport. So if we just double click on our edge, we're going to be now selecting this edge. And now if we want to cut away everything here, we want to make a seam at this region or with the selection, we can now go to UV and we can now hit cut UV edges. And now you can see we get a cut here as well, which also is represented here in 3D view as well. Disable and enable that right here. We can also do this in a faster way. Let's undo this. If we were to hit the hotkey, which is Shift X. Shift X is what I use all the time. And you can of course find all these hotkeys in the PDF. So you can also find it under Shift right mouse button as well. And we have cut as well if you prefer a marking menu. This is one of these which actually has a hotkey, so I just prefer to use the hotkey Shift X. So you can select this, Shift X, and you can just do that right here. So now if you want to move this eye out, what we can do is we can use the selection tools, which is quite intuitive. In order to select this whole thing, we can do this in two main ways. First, we can go to right mouse button, then we can select UVs here, then we can just double click it, then we can move it around. Or what we can do, we can right mouse button and a UV shell and just click it as well. This is a bit more intuitive because this is one click instead of two clicks, but this is also a more recent feature. And since I'm an old school Maya artist, I've just got used to using UV and just double clicking on it. So you'll see me do this throughout the series, but that's really because I'm old school. If I was new, I would use UV shell a lot more. So then you can just select it here and then we can just move it around like so. So what if we want to place this inside of here again and we want to merge this together? Well, there's two main ways of doing that. The first one is we could sew them together. So let's select these one now, and you can now see that they're selected here and selected here. And then we can shift right mouse button and we can do sew. But now you can see what happens. Yes, it does sew the edges, but it sews them in the center. It doesn't actually move these over. So what we then have to do, we have to move these over and then move them back to where they were. And then we could sew them together, shift right mouse button and sew. But an easier way of doing this, if we undo this again, Control Z, is if we select the border here and then we shift right mouse button and move and sew edges. Now you can see what it does. It sews the edges and it actually moves the entire thing over as well. So move and sew edges. And there we go. Now it's back to the exact point it was before. This is really the way I prefer to do it. With this model here, we don't really have to do a lot of cutting because this model here is already cut up. Obviously, I removed the inside of the mouth, ears, nose, and all that kind of stuff. So this is kind of ready for us to just unfold. So let me show you what unfolding does. This is kind of like when we have it this shape now, and we will just try to unfold it almost like you have an animal and turn into pelt or something like that, where you're making like a carpet out of the animal. That's what we're doing now. We're actually unfolding it down onto a 2D surface. So we can do this very easily by shift right mouse button, and then we go to unfold, hit to right and unfold as well. And now you can see what happens. Now it will actually unfold this so that before and after. So it's very, very quick to actually unfold this here. We can also go to UV tools here, and this is where we have all the different tools. So this is where you actually have, this is only in UV editing workspace here, but here we have all the tools you ever need. So if you're more comfortable with using the tools over here instead of marking menus, you can do that as well. So for instance, if you want to unfold something, you can just click here and you can just hit unfold. And that's exactly the same thing as going in here and unfolding. Again, that's completely up to you when it comes to personal preference. But it doesn't actually matter which one you use. There's a little tip as well. If you want to open up the settings for this, you can shift click on it as well, and this will open up the settings. You can see here, because Maya being Maya and it's not super consistent, there isn't really a box next to it. So shift click to get up the settings as well. Default settings for the unfold tool is most likely going to be good enough. But let's look quickly into the some settings here. So first one here is fix non-manifold geometry. That just means that if you have non-manifold geometry in it and you unfold, it's going to have a hard time with that. But now you can actually fix it here. Now I highly recommend that you disable this. The thing is, we don't really want our UV mapping to change our model, because now you can have all sorts of issues with that. So your model should really be 100% done before you start to unfold or UV map anything like that. We can also set iterations here. The more iterations it has, the longer it's going to take to unfold, but also the better the unfolding is going to be. So I prefer to set this to 10. This is perfectly fine. So we have two tools for unfolding, or rather making our UVs nice and unfolded. The first one is, well, unfold. And the second one is optimize. This is not really the same, but it's more of a relaxation tool. So if unfold just unfolds the entire thing, then optimize will optimize what's there. We'll just relax everything a little bit. For a model this light, it's not going to matter a lot, but for something heavier, we're going to see this quite apparent. So shift right mouse button and optimize, and then we can just optimize this right away. And you can see it just moves a little bit. It just optimizes a teeny tiny bit here. We can also click here as well, and then it will just optimize it here. Shift click to see settings, and we have very similar settings. We have the main one we want to look at here is iterations. We also have a tool here as well you might like. This is the optimize tool, or the unfold tool. This is where you can paint to actually get more unfolding in certain areas. Now let's undo all this, or let's rather do another planar map here. And now we can see what this does if we actually try to use the unfolding tool and just paint where you want unfolding. So this is quite cool, because now we actually get a live unfold in these areas. I normally don't really use this because I prefer to just do a global unfold on the entire thing. But this can also be quite handy. Use the B key to change the radius, and now you can just paint across here as well. Same with optimize. We can paint on top to really just optimize it. So definitely a useful tool and quite a recent addition to Maya as well. Then we can scale this guy down, because you can see now we don't really have a lot of actual stretching here now. So this is perfectly fine. Now we can just move this, scale this down like so, and then we can just scale it up so it's right in the center like so. Now another feature we're going to talk about is orient to edges. So let's just hide this guy, and here we have a guy which is already pre-made. Let's just assign the surface, the checker to him, like so. And you can see here what's happening is that this guy here is unfolded, but he is awfully off center. So what you often want is you want this guy to be perfectly in the middle, meaning you want him to be like, is rotated like so, hit the E key to rotate, W to move, and want him to be right in the center. You can also use snapping here as well. So you can hit the X key to snap it to the grid. We can hit the D key to move the pivot, and we can hold in the V key to snap it to a point. So now, for instance, we can take this point here, hold the X key, and now we can snap this exactly to the center, which is really useful, but you know, it's still off center here. So what we can do, we can use a tool called Orient to Edges. Where we can find it is if we go over here to the UV tools, and then we go under here to Arrange and Layout and Orient to Edges. So what you can see now happens is that we'll actually orient this entire thing. So this is completely now in like as a straight line. So if we set it like so, it's completely off base, off center. Then we select this single one here. We want this to be straight up and down. Then we set Orient to Edges, and now you can see what happens. It will move it, it will snap it to the nearest, I believe, 90 degrees. So if we want this to be the other way, we just move it up like so. Select the single edge and Orient to Edges. Now it's right dead in the center. Then next up, we will look at the layout tool. The layout tool is incredibly powerful, and so let's look into that. First, select our layout model here. We have some teeth, right mouse button, assign existing material, and we set this UV checker. So what we have here is we have a model which has UVs of completely different scales. and they're just messy as hell. So what we have here, as you see here, the scale is completely different between the two. And that's because it looks like this and is an absolute god-awful mess. So what we have to do, now we have to start to scale all of these down like so. Just move it down into the center, into the first UDIM here. It's like so. And then we have to start to optimize. We have to scale them all up one by one so that they're approximately the same size. Or we can do this in an automatic way. This is absolutely crazy and you will never do it like this. So what you can do is you can select all of them like so. Then we can go to Shift right mouse button and Layout. And then we go to the Layout UVs and we have a little checker box here. So let's talk about what this does. Let's just do Edit and Reset Settings so we make sure we don't have anything crazy going on. So now we have two settings we really want to talk about. Shell pre-rotation and shell pre-scaling. So that's what happens when we just hit this now. Now when we hit it and we look at the model here now, the checkers patterns are going to be exactly the same across all of them. And this is because this is set to preserve 3D ratios, which just means that it's now going to actually have the same scale in the UVs as it does in the 3D viewport, which is awesome. So now, for instance, if we were to scale this guy up like crazy, and then we select all of them, we set shell pre-scaling off, now you can see what happens. Now it actually preserves the scale I've already set here, which is dead wrong, which causes all sorts of issues. So we really want to make sure that we set this to pre-scaling to preserve 3D ratios. And now you can see what happens. Really nice and clean. But there's still a problem though, is that this is still messy. Some shells go this way, some shells go that way. So what we have to do as well, don't have to. One thing we can do is we can set shell pre-rotation and we can set this to horizontal or vertical. Let's see what happens when we set this to horizontal. Now you can see that they were all aligned to be horizontal. This will just look at the majority of the shape here, and then we'll look at this looks to be the horizontal axis of it. But in this case, we probably want this to be vertical because the teeth are vertical. So now you can see here these are actually flipped right the other way because the orientation UVs. So we can now set this here to be vertical. So pre-shell rotation set to vertical. And there we go. Now we have, with just like a few clicks, we've now made a real nice and clean UV map for all of these teeth. And they're flowing really nicely up and down like so. So the UV layout tool is super powerful, and really take a look at these settings here. Pre-shell rotation and pre-shell scaling. Then we will take a look at another feature as well, which is super handy. This is symmetrize. Another model missing shaders. You're going to be used to this by now, where you're going to be right click and assign UV checker. And there we go. So what we have now, we have a model here now, which is perfectly aligned to the center. We used orient to edges for this. We selected here and we selected this. So it's just aligned really well to it. But you can see here the model isn't symmetrical, which is a real pain. The way we can make this symmetrical now is using a very simple symmetrize tool. So we can access this if we go to Tools, all the way to the bottom, and it's called Symmetrize. And now we can select the center edge, basically select the edge you want to be the center. And now you can see what happens. If we were to paint on this surface now, you can see that this actually symmetrizes it. If you go to Tool Settings now, let's just reset this. So you can now set the scale here. Let's just undo it. Now we can just paint in where we want the symmetry, like so. So really nice. Now it just becomes symmetrical. Or if we undo this, we can now set this to flood the shell. And this is going to flood this entire thing. So click now, and now just one click and the entire thing is symmetrical. Which means now we have 100% symmetrical UV shell, which means that if you paint something here in something like Photoshop and you were to mirror it over, it will be perfectly symmetrical. This is just really, really handy when you're doing texturing. There's no reason not to have them symmetrical. The unfolding is generally pretty good, but it can be quite tricky to make the model perfectly symmetrical. So that's why we have a symmetrize tool like this as well. And then we have texel density. If we were to enable texel density folder, and let's just select both of these guys and right click and assign UV shader. So here we have two models, and these two have a different texture density, which means you can see here, right, that they have different scales when it comes to the checker. And this is very problematic in a production. This is more of a production tool than anything else. This is where you often have a density of your texture maps and everything will have this density. So what we can do is we can copy the texture density from one to the other. So they become exactly the same and they occupy the exact same amount of space in texture when it comes to texture density. So we select the model here, which has the good texture density. Then we go all the way down to we go down here from the top and we go on a transform. And here we have on the bottom of transform, we have get and set. If we hit get, now we're going to get a number here, which is the texture density of this model. And now we can click on the other one and we can hit set. And there we go. Now these two have exactly the same texture density. Yeah, the rotation is different and all that, but that's a completely separate issue. They now have exactly the same density, and you can copy this between different models. For instance, if you want to have a cube here, and we assign a shader to it, assign existing material, and we want to have this to have the same density as well as this one, we can now just do the same thing and hit set. Now you can see it becomes exactly the same. So this is just really useful in any sort of production because you really want to make sure your textile density is the same. If you have no idea what the hell I'm talking about now and you're a hobbyist and you're not really worrying about production, don't worry too much about this. But for any kind of production, particularly games, this is essential. So for UDIMs, this is a system used in Mari. And Mari is a texturing software which is used in visual effects. And this is what I spent my entire career in. And this just means that you can have a character like this over multiple maps. So anything which inside this one here is one texture map. Anything inside here is one texture map. So you reach a point where instead of having like a 2K map, 4K, 8K, 16K, 32K and all that, instead of doing that, we're just going to assign different texture maps to it, which is a lot better. So the way we can do this in Maya is very simple. If you want to move something across a UDIM, you just select the shell, right mouse button, UV shell, and then we can go to transform right here, and then we can move it around. Now, by default, it's just going to be set to 0.1. If we set this to 1, now we can start to move this around using these arrow keys here, or even handier, we can use the actual arrow keys on the keyboard. That's what I'm doing now. So now in a very quick way, we can just move these guys around. This is what I did for all the movies I worked on. We had the head was maybe here, the arm was here, and so on. So a really quick way of actually working with UDIMs. So the way you would do it is, let's say you want the left side to be in one UDIM and the right side to be in the other. You would select the center here, like so, and hit Shift X to cut it. Select the UV shell. Now you just move this one up, like so. So you would just now have one side in one model and one UDIM, and the other in the other UDIM as well, like so. So UV mapping in Maya is incredibly powerful, and once you get a hang of just a very few tools, it's going to be child's play. The hard thing about UV mapping is really kind of understanding where the cuts are going to be, and we're going to look a bit into that in the next chapter. But just to reiterate, there are just a few tools we have to know in order to get started with this. Let's show you how quick this can actually be. We select our model, then we go to UV, and we do planar map, then we select everything here, and we go to unfold and unfold. Then we can rotate around, and then we can select one edge, and then we can go to or arrange and layout and orient to edges. Then we can select everything, scale it down, and just make sure it's right in the center. Just hit the X key and just snap it to the center. And this is really it in order to get good UV maps. Everything is a combination of these tools. It's a combination of move and sew, cut, and unfold and optimize. And in some cases, like the teeth, we will use layout.